how much of that has impact, and how do you measure that? How much of this policy, for example, NREGA, has been able to reduce poverty? I mean, you have an elasticity in terms of states and all, but still every new policy should have some impact. So for that, what are the measurements?
So I can suggest, I mean, there are, I can suggest a few papers for you if it is of interest to look at of how you could measure or how people have measured the impact of NREGA. So there's something by Shamika Ravi at the Indian School of Business, and then there are Clement, Imbens and PAP have done some work. We've also done some work, but there's several papers, and the idea behind NREGA is a particularly difficult one to evaluate for two reasons. One is that when you want to look at the impact of a policy, ideally you have to compare it before and after and with and without, right. So you want to be able to compare it in areas where the policy exists to where it doesn't, but that should be, this area that you select should be comparable in other dimensions other than that policy. What makes it difficult in NREGA, for example, when you look at Bihar, is that it was rolled out in all districts simultaneously in the first round. So all the phase 1, there were several phase 1 districts in Bihar, but all the other districts also, the state government with its own resources started scaling up the program, introduced the program. So actually within the state you have no part of the state where the scheme didn't exist. So when you want to measure the impact, you're looking at an economy-wide phenomenon, which makes it very hard to measure. So that's why I think NREGA becomes particularly tricky in Bihar, less so in some of the other states. The other thing that makes it difficult is that if the program works well as it was designed, then its impacts will come not just from the employment it creates for those who work in the scheme, it will come from the spillover effects it has on the labor market. Because it would raise the reservation wage. If there is a program out there that guarantees employment at a given wage, then nobody in the private labor market should be willing to work at a wage that's lower than that, right. So because of it raising the reservation wage, the impact will come through that. So it also, whenever you're looking at these kinds of spillover effects, measuring impact is much harder. But it can be done. I mean, you can do something, not as clean as, I saw that one of your professors is associated with JPAL and does RCTs and things like that. So obviously NREGA is not amenable to that. But the studies that have looked at it in Andhra suggest there is impact. In Bihar suggest that there isn't impact. In fact, in Bihar the coverage is, there's a lot of unmet demand still. There's many more people who want work under the scheme than are actually getting it, which could be capacity constraints, it could be other more, other types of possibilities as well. But I think what you can say for NREGA is that in the states where it's worked, it has had an impact. Does it explain at the national level a large share of the decline? I would hazard a guess, no. Not of these magnitudes. Just because it isn't working at the scale at which it should be in order to have these levels of impacts.
How much of a problem is underestimation of food consumption at the lower income levels or the data?
Yeah. So we did some, actually I haven't done it for 2011-12 yet, but we did some work in 2009-10 in terms of basically aggregating up the reported consumption for rice and wheat and stuff like that, and actually matched up pretty well with the aggregate numbers. So my guess is that in fact the surveys do a reasonably good job of picking up consumption at the lower end of the distribution, but they do a miserable job of picking up the top end. So we are grossly underestimating inequality, but not necessarily underestimating poverty. Because when you look at the items that are consumed by the poor, those are the ones where you get a reasonable match in the aggregate.
Initially, when the poverty lines were established, they were based on calories, calorie consumption and so on. So in-depth studies of that kind. But are there such in-depth studies in recent times as well, like linking income to food consumption, especially at the below the poverty people. No?
So like estimations with angle curves and stuff like that. Is that what you are?
Yeah, no, but just below the poverty line, no, how closely is the income level linked to the food consumption, no, and therefore how good a measure you get of let's say hunger, no, from the income numbers, no.
I haven't seen anything recently. I haven't looked, but I haven't.
There has been nothing.
Huh?
There's been nothing.
Yeah, I haven't come across.
So the interesting question actually is, since it was done in what, 72, 73?
The original. Yeah.
Original one. So were consumption patterns then and consumption patterns now different? And you pointed out to some calorie income differences.
Yeah, the calorie
Is there
income.
something?
Yeah, consumption patterns have changed. I mean, it's still the case that food is the vast majority of in terms, it has the highest budget share. It looks sensible also when you compare rural and urban areas. So you have higher expenditures on food in rural as a share of the budget in rural than in urban. Food is higher for people who are lower down in the income distribution. So the patterns look pretty sensible. But it is declining. I mean, so, and in fact, the update that happened to in the poverty lines by the Tendulkar committee, they did take into account. They did change, they updated the budget shares, because the budget shares for them only came in the estimation in two ways. They came in largely in the estimation of the spatial price indices.
The lines, the poverty lines that we talk about mainly deal with monetary issues, maybe on the consumption side or some other side. So there are certain aspects like access to health, access to education, which get excluded when you take a poverty line as such. So you also have a human development index in that regard. So from the World Bank perspective, do you look at the poverty line primarily, or do you look at certain other parameters, or has there been more research in this particular field?
I mean, I wouldn't say that we are necessarily, we are obviously a very tiny player in the research field, and there's a lot of people who are looking at these issues. So Sabina Al-Kire, there's an Oxford group that has been looking specifically at the measurement of poverty, bringing in these other dimensions. One of the things that we do is in the design of our own programs and our strategy, at least for India, we don't focus only on in our own thinking, it's not, we don't focus only on the poverty line. So that's why for us, monitoring what's happening at twice the poverty line is also important, because there are many people above the poverty line who have very poor learning outcomes. So on the enrollment side, we have, there's been a huge amount of progress, and so gender gaps are closing, gaps between scheduled castes and other groups are closing, also the same for slightly less so, but it's also closing for scheduled tribes. Where you don't see improvements is, that's what the Pratham and Asar data are showing on learning. It's a dismal situation. And health, on nutrition, on malnutrition, we just don't know. The next NFHS survey is now in the field. So our information dates to 2005-06, and that was not a good story. So that's why we also, we follow what's happening at 1 and 2, not just what the government refers to as.
Just to take this forward, in my very limited understanding, declines in poverty and changes in health and educational parameters, I sense that there is this huge time lag, and so I wonder whether it is even correct to compare, the GDP growth or the poverty decline along with these health and education estimates, and I'm not sure that we have a sense of how long these time lags are actually have. So I just feel that what we tend to do is then we might be misrepresenting ourselves in painting a picture where we are taking two completely different things at different time scales and trying to match them and say, here is one unified picture of things.
I mean, I think I agree with you. I would only maybe just make like two related comments. One is that other countries have done it faster. So the time lags in India seem pretty long, longer than other countries at similar levels of development. So it's not necessarily the case that it's, there isn't like there used to be a Hindu rate of growth. There's no Hindu rate of, there shouldn't be like one that would keep us at at the pace at which things have been improving. That's one, I mean, one reflection. And the other is that that one of the things that we know, certainly from the Indian experience, but from other countries as well, is that income growth will not automatically translate into these things. Yeah, so you can't assume that if you get growth right, the other things will automatically follow. In fact, I think sometimes I feel, and a lot of the literature feels, it's not like my personal feeling, but there's lots of evidence also to suggest that you need to get the health and education system in place also for growth. It's also important for that side, right? So I know if you follow the for example, the Bhagavati Panagriya book and the debate, they have a very nice or not nice, well, very provocative hypotheses about track 1 and track 2 reforms, right? So track 1, get growth right, and then you have the track 2 side in which it's then the money will start flow, growth will generate the resources to work on health and education, and those things in any case will also improve, but you need to focus on them as track 2. And I think in my mind, a more compelling phrasing is that you need to work certainly simultaneously on health and education as independent objectives in of themselves, but also as a means to increase the pace of growth. So it doesn't really answer, I don't know your question, but just some related reflections. Yeah.
Actually, you remind me of, there was a paper earlier from the bank, I think it was by Martin, in which he compared Kerala and Bihar.
Huh.
Bihar, and then he basically looked at
With Gaurav Dutt, this is that, yeah, yeah.
And there the interesting point that they raised is the one about how you don't see the reduction in poverty in Bihar because of
These initial conditions, yeah.
right? So I mean, unless the initial conditions are the same, you're going to get it.
Yeah. So I showed that graph of the elasticity of poverty reduction with respect to growth, the dispersion across states. The paper that, so this is just more updated data, but the paper that you're referring to, essentially they're taking those and saying, well, what explains that dispersion? And is that one of the factors they point to is that these initial conditions matter very much. So the extent to which growth translates into poverty reduction depends on whether you have a healthy, productive, healthy, educated workforce.
Yeah. I was just wondering, when you do these studies, these are more like as is or more of an explanatory sort of descriptive study. So is there any effort by the World Bank or your organization in terms of comparing as to, for example, we see a stark difference in the pattern from 2004-5 onwards as compared to what was before then. So is there some effort to sort of gauge and monitor what happened in those time periods, what was so different after 2004-5, and maybe trying to explain something of why such a phenomena is taking place. Where we see poverty reduction, we also see jobless growth, we also see jobs declining, we see people becoming more de-skilled. And there's another related question. We see the India story, we see how we are progressing as over these years. Is there any other country or sort of nation which has gone through some sort of similar trends, so to say, and we can sort of maybe take a leaf out of them and see, and maybe just to understand
You meant regressing or progressing?
No, I was just wondering, because this is what do we derive out of this, or how do we sort of help ourselves in informing policy as well as to what should we do in the future? Is this some kind?
So you're not going to fool me into being prescriptive here, so I'm not going to go that far. So into thinking about what should we do. I mean, I think because what I've done here for you is raise a whole bunch of questions. I've said this is what we are looking at. What do you think happened? I don't know the answer. I mean, I don't know the answer. We study, huh? Yeah, there's a manufacturing middle, there's potentially a skill story, there's a delivery system story. There's many, it's hard to pass out which one. In terms of in looking at international, the question on what do we do to monitor in between, I mean,